Wealthy woman refuses veteran a seat. Then he pulls out a medal. Linda Coleman sat at her favorite table at the Blue Star Café with the same feeling of comfort she experienced every morning upon entering that establishment. The bustle of the place, the aromas of fresh coffee, and the murmur of casual conversations made her feel at home. It was a kind of refuge, a space where I could relax and, at the same time, maintain the appearance of sophistication and elegance. As he walked through the cafe's glass door, the energy seemed to shift around him. The place was always meticulously arranged, the tables arranged perfectly, the china shining in the soft light that fell through the large windows. Every detail there was chosen to create an aura of refinement, something that Linda had already incorporated into her own identity. The Blue Star was the place where she most liked to spend her mornings, whether to do discreet business or to simply connect with friends and acquaintances from her social elite. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now let's continue. Linda, 45, was an upper-class, elegant, and imposing woman. Her designer clothes and carefully selected accessories made her a striking presence. Her hair, always impeccably combed, was a reflection of meticulous care for her image. With a successful career in finance and a social schedule that left little room for a personal life, Linda had become a well-known figure in Manhattan circles. Her lifestyle was overflowing with luxury, and as much as she convinced herself that she didn't care about other people's opinions, it was clear that how people saw her was important to her. Always with a controlled smile on her face, Linda cultivated a facade of self-sufficiency. There wasn't much room for doubts or insecurities, as she knew very well what was expected of her. However, despite her facade of absolute control, Linda carried a vague sense of discomfort that she herself could not identify. The superficial shine of his social life was sometimes a distraction from the deeper emptiness. She had already achieved everything she wanted: a big, luxurious house on the Upper East Side, a luxury car, trips to the most exclusive cities in the world. But there was something about her routine that didn't completely fill the space in her soul. Linda never allowed herself to think about it much. Instead, she threw herself headlong into social commitments and new work projects, always looking for new milestones to achieve. The morning at the Blue Star Café started like any other. Linda was greeted by the waiter with a polite smile, which made her feel on top of the world. He led her to his table, the same as always, with a perfect view of the busy Manhattan street. Linda settled in with her cup of coffee, feeling comfortable and superior. All around, the cafe was full of a distinguished clientele, made up of people who, like her, maintained a life of high standards. At neighboring tables, low voices murmured about the latest charity gala or investments in the stock markets. Business conversations were occasionally interrupted by discreet laughter, while waiters circulated with precision and grace, ensuring customers had everything they wanted. The harmony of the environment perfectly reflected the lifestyle that Linda had embraced and felt comfortable with. With her coffee in hand, Linda pulled out her phone and began checking her messages. There were a number of appointments scheduled for the afternoon, including a business meeting with a possible new investor. His mind was focused on the near future, always on the lookout for the next opportunity. With each notification, she felt even more secure in her place in the world. For Linda, success was a direct reflection of her ability to stay in control, to never deviate from the image she had built for herself. Over the years, she has learned to filter out distractions. Ordinary people who didn't run in the same social circles or couldn't understand the magnitude of his life rarely deserved his attention. Linda believed there was an invisible line between those who achieved what she achieved and those who fell behind. The rest, well, it was just a blurry background. It was then that James Hart walked through the cafe door. His presence, however discreet it was, interrupted the flow of Linda's morning. She didn't notice him right away, but something in the air seemed to change when he entered. James was an elderly man. His hair was already completely gray and his body, although still erect, bore the signs of past decades. He wore a simple tweed jacket, a little wrinkled, and pants that looked like they might have been made for someone younger. His hands, which moved slowly, held tightly to a worn leather bag, which seemed to carry stories much older than him. James had the kind of presence that couldn't be ignored, but Linda, immersed in his. Linda Coleman had spent the majority of her life building the perfect world around her, brick by carefully placed brick. She had a career many envied, a social life that glittered with exclusivity, and a reputation that few dared to challenge. The glamorous Manhattan penthouse, the elegant soirees, the power lunches, these were not just symbols of success. They were the very pillars of her identity. The world saw Linda as a woman who had it all: beauty, intelligence, wealth, and influence. And for a long time, Linda believed this was everything she needed to be fulfilled. But recently, something had begun to shift. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible at first, had started to make itself heard amidst the noise of her busy life. It was a discomfort she couldn't quite place, a vague sense of longing that gnawed at her from the inside. It wasn't that she wasn't grateful for the life she had. How could she not be? She had worked hard to reach the top, clawing her way through the competitive world of business and philanthropy. But still, the whisper persisted, growing louder as the days passed. Something was missing, and Linda couldn't ignore it anymore. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Linda was seated at her usual table at the Blue Star Café in the heart of Manhattan, her laptop open in front of her. She was going over a proposal for a new charitable initiative she was spearheading, but her mind wasn't fully in it. She glanced around the cafe, her eyes briefly scanning the familiar faces of her social circle: wealthy business partners, well-known socialites, journalists from the city's most prestigious magazines. Linda smiled politely at a few people, but even in the midst of this bustling, vibrant scene, she felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. Her phone buzzed, and she immediately glanced down at the screen. Another text from her assistant. "The press is asking if you'd like to give a quote about the charity event next week. They're pushing for a statement." Linda sighed inwardly. She was used to these requests, but today they felt more like interruptions than opportunities. When did everything become about appearances? She tapped out a quick response and placed her phone back on the table, her fingers momentarily lingering on the edge of her coffee cup. The truth was, Linda had begun to grow weary of it all. The constant pressure to maintain an image, the endless parade of events where she had to smile and nod, the shallow conversations that left her feeling more empty than connected. She had built a life that was admired from the outside, but it no longer felt like hers. There was something undeniably hollow about her existence, an emptiness she hadn't been able to shake, no matter how much success she accumulated. But the real turning point came when Linda attended a private fundraiser for a veterans charity a few nights before. She had been invited by a well-known philanthropist, a woman she had known for years, and it was one of those events that promised to be the pinnacle of her social calendar. As she entered the elegant ballroom, she felt the familiar rush of excitement, the flash of cameras, the murmur of compliments from admirers, the brief but invigorating conversations with important figures in her social circle. Linda was in her element, but as she mingled with the crowd, she couldn't shake the sensation that everyone around her was playing a part in a performance. She was halfway through a conversation about a new business venture with an old colleague when a man entered the room. He was an older gentleman, dressed simply in a dark blue suit that looked worn, as if it had seen its fair share of history. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his presence was calm, dignified. Linda didn't recognize him, but there was something about him that made the chatter around her pause for a brief moment. As he moved through the room, people subtly shifted aside to make way for him. It wasn't that he was imposing, but there was an undeniable aura of respect that seemed to radiate from him. Linda glanced at him once more, noticing the quiet reverence with which he was being treated. The man made his way toward a corner of the room where a small group of veterans from various wars had gathered. She overheard one of them mentioning that he was a recipient of the Medal of Honor, and the words hit Linda like a sudden gust of wind. The Medal of Honor, a prestigious award that was not given lightly. Linda knew enough about the military and its history to understand the significance of such an accolade. Yet, despite his remarkable history, the man seemed perfectly content to remain in the background, quietly engaging in conversation with the others. As the evening wore on, Linda couldn't help but feel a stirring inside her. The contrast between this man, so humble, so grounded, and the glittering, self-congratulatory world she inhabited was stark. She watched as he conversed with his fellow veterans, laughing at old stories and exchanging quiet words of wisdom. There was no desperation for attention, no eager smile for the photographers. He seemed to be living a life that had meaning, that was not dependent on external validation. The thought unsettled Linda. It wasn't that she didn't admire the man, it was more that she envied him in a way she hadn't experienced before. Later that evening, Linda was once again approached by a journalist, eager to get her thoughts on the event. They had been waiting for her statement, as always. It was part of the routine. But as the journalist set up his microphone, Linda couldn't shake the feeling of disconnection. Her responses were still polite, still carefully crafted to meet the expectations of the moment. But as she glanced once more toward the man in the blue suit, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to confront before. She was tired. Tired of the act. Tired of the constant striving to be seen, to be admired, to be important. She was tired of the life she had built around herself, an image of success that no longer felt like it belonged to her. By the time Linda returned home that night, she was quiet, reflective in a way that was unfamiliar to her. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay in control, to manage the expectations of others with ease. But now, for the first time, she questioned the very foundation of her life. Why had she spent so many years pursuing external markers of success? Why had she placed so much value on being admired and respected by others? And most importantly, why did she feel so empty, despite everything she had achieved? Linda sat down at her desk and stared at the array of awards and accolades displayed on the shelves. They were impressive, yes, proof of a career built on hard work and determination. Yet they seemed so insignificant now. As she looked at the gleaming trophies and framed photographs, she felt a profound sense of disillusionment. She had spent years chasing the approval of others, but she was beginning to understand that this approval would never fill the emptiness inside her. For the first time in a long while, Linda questioned everything. Was this really the life she wanted? Had she allowed herself to be defined by the applause, the social status, the public image she had carefully constructed? She had spent so long proving herself to others that she had forgotten what it was like to live for herself, to find fulfillment from within, rather than seeking it from external sources. Linda knew something had to change. She didn't know what that change would look like yet, but she understood that the emptiness she felt wasn't something that could be filled with more accolades or more success. She needed to find a way to live with meaning, to reconnect with her true self, and to stop pretending that the things she had been chasing were what she really wanted. The following days were filled with introspection. Linda couldn't shake the image of the elderly veteran, his quiet strength, his sense of peace. He had lived a life that was rich with purpose, not because of the medals or the recognition, but because of the quiet dignity with which he had lived. It wasn't the applause he sought. It was something deeper, something more profound. And for the first time, Linda realized that she had spent years striving for the wrong things. The external validation she had been chasing had never been enough, and it would never be enough. As Linda sat by her window that evening, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance, she knew that she had to change. She could no longer keep living the life she had created out of a need for approval. The life she had built, this polished, perfect version of herself, wasn't the life she truly wanted. She didn't need more recognition. What she needed was something deeper, something more authentic. In that moment, Linda understood the most important lesson of all. Real fulfillment came from living in alignment with her true self, not from the applause of others. She had spent so much time trying to build an identity based on external validation, but now, she realized that the only validation worth seeking was the one that came from within. Linda had always prided herself on knowing exactly where she stood. Her life, carefully crafted and meticulously orchestrated, had no room for uncertainty. She knew where to sit, whom to speak to, and which events to attend to ensure her place at the top of Manhattan's social ladder. The elegance of her apartment, the tailored suits, the exclusive dinner parties, It was all a choreography she had perfected. Linda thrived in control, in knowing exactly what would come next, how every interaction would unfold. But in that moment, as she stared across the room at James Hart, she found herself suddenly confronted with a feeling she couldn't name. For the first time in years, Linda felt something akin to discomfort, something unfamiliar, something she had spent decades avoiding. When James Hart had initially approached her table, she had dismissed him with the practiced ease that came from a lifetime of privilege. His request to share her table, in such a crowded cafe, had seemed almost beneath her. Why should she, a woman of stature, share her space with someone who, at first glance, appeared so inconsequential? But then something happened. He didn't react with the typical submission or awkwardness that most people would. Instead, he had offered a quiet, respectful refusal of her denial. His words were measured, his posture dignified, and it made her pause. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected him to be so calm, so assured in the face of her refusal. It wasn't until he revealed the Medal of Honor that her world shifted, if only for a moment. The sight of the medal, worn and tarnished from decades of service, made her stop in her tracks. A ripple of disbelief ran through her as she considered the gravity of what she had just witnessed. This man, this elderly, seemingly inconspicuous man, had lived a life far beyond the grasp of her own world. He had sacrificed, fought, and been honored for his bravery in ways that she, with all her wealth and connections, could never comprehend. The incongruity of it all struck her like a blow. She realized, in that instant, how little she truly understood about life outside the insulated bubble of her own. Yet, instead of feeling humbled, Linda had recoiled. She had brushed him off, not out of malice, but out of a deep-seated instinct to protect the carefully constructed walls of her identity. Her world was built on appearances, on comfort, and she couldn't allow this brief encounter to shake her too much. She turned back to her phone, her mind scrambling for control, trying to dismiss the intrusion. But despite her best efforts, she found that she couldn't quite shake the feeling that lingered inside her, a feeling she couldn't ignore. As the minutes ticked by, Linda found herself staring at James from across the room. He sat alone at a table in the corner, his posture straight and calm, as though nothing had happened. There was something oddly serene about him, something that made Linda feel restless in comparison. She watched as he quietly ate his meal, oblivious to the attention he was beginning to attract. The patrons of the cafe, who had been lost in their own conversations, had now begun to notice the man in their midst. Whispers spread quickly. Linda saw the first nod of recognition from a nearby table, followed by a second and a third. James Hart's presence, so quiet and unassuming, had begun to create a stir. Suddenly, Linda felt something shift within herself. She was no longer in control of the situation, no longer the center of the cafe's attention. The attention had drifted away from her and toward the humble, elderly man. She could hear the soft murmur of voices, the low hum of admiration from those who now knew who he was. The room seemed to come alive with a different energy, one that she hadn't expected, one that she didn't know how to respond to. It wasn't long before the applause began, soft at first, hesitant, then growing louder as more people recognized him. The small cafe, once filled with the usual chatter of business deals and social pleasantries, now hummed with reverence. Linda sat frozen in her seat, her eyes fixed on James. She couldn't believe it. How could this be happening? How could this man, who had so quietly walked into the cafe, now be the focus of so much admiration? The applause was not directed at her. It wasn't for her wealth, her connections, or her impeccable fashion sense. It was for something far deeper, something Linda had never truly encountered. It was for James Hart's sacrifice, his courage, and the quiet dignity with which he carried his history. The realization hit her hard. This wasn't a scene she was familiar with. Linda was used to being admired, to being sought after for her status, her influence, her wealth. But admiration based on genuine respect, based on something beyond surface-level appearances, was something entirely new. The contrast between the life she had built and the life James Hart had lived was stark, and the more she thought about it, the more she felt as though the ground was slipping beneath her. How had she spent so many years cultivating an existence built entirely on things that now seemed so shallow? The applause in the cafe grew louder, and Linda's face flushed with a mixture of discomfort and awe. She couldn't look away. She couldn't deny the pang of shame that twisted in her chest. In all her years of privilege, all her accomplishments, she had never once experienced anything like this. No one had ever looked at her the way these strangers were looking at James. No one had ever applauded her life with such genuine admiration. No one had ever acknowledged her as a person beyond her status, beyond her wealth. She felt a tightening in her tea. Wrote as she watched James nod humbly, his face a mask of modesty, as if this recognition were something he had long since grown accustomed to, something that no longer held any meaning for him. The crowd's cheers seemed to echo in Linda's mind, growing louder and louder until it felt like they were directed not at him, but at her. The applause wasn't just for James Hart. It was, in some strange, unspoken way, also for Linda. It was a reminder that there was more to life than what she had spent all these years chasing. She wasn't the one who deserved this level of reverence. She hadn't earned it, and yet, it was as if the universe had turned its gaze on her in this moment, forcing her to confront everything she had been running from. Her stomach churned with a mixture of guilt and realization. She had spent so much of her life building an empire based on the values of wealth, success, and social recognition. She had surrounded herself with people who admired her for what she represented, but none of them had ever seen the real Linda. None of them had ever truly looked beyond the surface. She had been so busy trying to maintain her position, so preoccupied with the next big deal, the next gala, the next appearance, that she had lost touch with the very things that truly mattered. What had she given the world? What had she ever really done for anyone other than herself? In that moment, Linda realized that the walls she had built around herself, walls of wealth and privilege, of social status and control, were not as secure as she had once believed. They were fragile, crumbling under the weight of the one thing she had spent her entire life avoiding: humility. The realization struck her like a thunderbolt. She had lived her life thinking she was untouchable, that her status could protect her from the vulnerabilities that plagued others. But James Hart had just shattered that illusion. In his quiet dignity, in his selflessness, he had shown Linda the one thing that she lacked: the ability to be seen for who she truly was, not for what she had. The truth, harsh and undeniable, began to sink in. Linda's desire to be seen, to be respected, to be admired for her accomplishments, this was not what she had truly wanted. What she craved, deep down, was something entirely different. She longed for real human connection, for the kind of recognition that wasn't built on status or wealth. She had spent so many years building a life of comfort, but that comfort had come at a great cost: her own authenticity. And now, for the first time in years, Linda was faced with a situation that demanded her to reckon with her own inadequacies, her own failure to live a life of true substance. Her gaze shifted back to James Hart. The applause had died down, but the impact of that moment lingered in the air, thick and undeniable. James was now finishing his meal, unaware of the inner turmoil Linda was experiencing. For him, this was just another day. For Linda, it was a turning point, an uncomfortable, unsettling one. She couldn't unsee what had just happened, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't know what to do next. This was the unfamiliar situation she had unknowingly stepped into. Linda had always been in control, always had the upper hand. But now, she was the one feeling vulnerable, exposed, and uncertain. The safe, predictable world she had cultivated was suddenly not enough. It was in that quiet realization that Linda understood. She had entered a new phase of her life, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days following the incident at the cafe were a blur for Linda Coleman. She was still processing the shock she'd felt that morning, the strange combination of awe and discomfort that had settled in her chest after James Hart's Medal of Honor had been revealed. The incident had lingered in her mind like a cloud, constantly hovering over her, making it impossible for her to focus on her usual distractions. Her emails piled up, phone calls went unanswered, and meetings that normally would have been a source of satisfaction felt somehow hollow. Everything felt off. The world she had so carefully constructed seemed suddenly foreign, and Linda was beginning to feel like an outsider in her own life. Her apartment, once a place of peace, now seemed vast and empty. She had always filled the silence with the hum of her schedule, appointments, social engagements, business calls, but now that hum seemed distant and mechanical. As she walked through her tastefully decorated living room, the towering bookshelves filled with the latest bestsellers, the fine art on the walls that spoke of her wealth and taste, Linda was haunted by an unsettling thought. Is this all there is? The question clung to her, relentless, pulling her attention away from the luxuries she had worked so hard to accumulate. What troubled her most wasn't that she had spent her life in pursuit of these comforts. No. What disturbed her was the realization that those comforts had come at a steep price, the loss of a connection to something deeper, something she couldn't quite name but knew she had been missing. The sincerity of James Hart's quiet dignity, his humble confidence in the face of his past, made Linda's own life feel shallow. She wasn't angry at him. She was angry at herself for not having known sooner how much she had neglected the more important aspects of life. She tried to ignore the growing sense of discomfort, burying it beneath the noise of her life. She immersed herself in the whirlwind of meetings and phone calls, throwing herself into work as she always had. Yet, no matter how many projects she took on, no matter how many events she attended, the disquiet in her chest refused to subside. It was like trying to fill a hole with material things, only to find the hole growing bigger and deeper with every attempt. Linda decided she would do what she always did when faced with discomfort: take control. She would show the world and herself that she was still the same Linda Coleman, the powerful, successful woman who had everything under control. She would go to another gala, attend another board meeting, meet with more influential people. She would outwork the problem, outshine it, drown it in the distractions that had always brought her comfort. But each time she tried to re-enter her old routine, she found that it no longer had the same allure. One evening, Linda was at a charity auction, a lavish affair held in a grand ballroom downtown, when the sensation of being disconnected from everything around her hit her again. She was standing at a bar, sipping a glass of champagne, engaging in a conversation with a well-known art dealer. The usual social banter filled the air, comments about the latest fashion trends, the political climate, upcoming social events. But Linda felt a growing sense of alienation as she listened to the superficial exchanges. She had long been a part of this world, but now, surrounded by a sea of well-dressed, equally well-connected people, it felt like she was looking in from the outside. In that moment, something clicked. She was no longer interested in the trivialities of what everyone around her valued. The art dealer was talking about a painting she had no intention of buying, and Linda caught herself thinking about how little she cared about the auction. She didn't care about any of it. The people, the deals, the gold-plated facades, they all felt empty. Linda had been living in a world of hollow success, and now that she could see it for what it was suffocating her. Her thoughts turned to James Hart again. She remembered the way he had quietly accepted the applause in the cafe, not basking in the recognition, but simply acknowledging it with grace. What was it like to live a life that didn't need external validation? Linda didn't know. She had been taught to chase applause, to earn admiration, to live for the approval of others. But James Hart didn't need any of that. His quiet strength, his simple existence, had touched something deep within her. That night, after the auction, Linda went home and stood in front of her full-length mirror. She studied her reflection. The woman staring back at her seemed foreign now. She had always been proud of her appearance, her tailored suits, her perfect hair, her flawless skin. She had built an identity around her looks, her accomplishments, and her reputation. But now, in the silence of her apartment, that image felt hollow. What was she really? Who was she, beyond the woman everyone thought she was? And more importantly, who did she want to be? The question echoed in her mind for days. It was no longer enough to be a successful businesswoman, a respected figure in high society. Linda longed for something more. She wanted to live a life that had real meaning, to make an impact that wasn't based on how many deals she closed or how many people admire her. But she had no idea where to start. How could she shift from a life built on superficial accomplishments to one that was rooted in deeper values? She found herself returning to the cafe, the Blue Star Café, the place where it all began. The moment had been haunting her. What had it been about James Hart that struck her so deeply? Why did his presence, his simple dignity, resonate in a way that all her wealth and social standing never had? The cafe had been packed again, but she didn't hesitate to approach the counter. She had already ordered her coffee when she saw an elderly man sitting at a table near the window. He was alone, with nothing to set him apart from the other patrons, save for the quiet aura of dignity he seemed to radiate. This time, Linda didn't hesitate. She walked over and asked if she could join him. Her voice was steady, but there was an unfamiliar warmth in it, a sense of vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to show in a long time. The man, who was in his late 60s or early 70s, looked up and smiled. His eyes, though tired, were full of wisdom. "Yes, of course," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. As Linda sat down, she didn't know what to say. She had no grand speech to offer, no excuse for her sudden desire to connect with this stranger. But something in her felt the need to break away from the persona she had been wearing for so long. She didn't want to be the powerful businesswoman right now. She just wanted to be human. I've been thinking about something," she said, her voice softer than usual. "About people. And about life. I think I've spent so many years focused on the wrong things." The man nodded gently, as if he had heard this sentiment many times before. "Life is often like that," he said quietly. "We get caught up in all the noise, thinking it's the most important thing, only to realize later that the quiet moments hold the answers." Linda exhaled, a weight lifting off her shoulders. There was no judgment in his voice, no expectation. He didn't care that she was a wealthy woman or that she had once been at the top of her game. He simply listened. For the first time in a long while, Linda allowed herself to feel something other than the need to be impressive, to be admired. She allowed herself to feel human. They spoke for an hour about life, about regrets, about the choices that shape us. The conversation wasn't earth-shattering, but it was real. It was grounded in mutual respect, in shared understanding. When she left the cafe that day, Linda knew she was starting to change. She wasn't sure how, or what it would look like, but something inside her had begun to shift. She was adapting to the discomfort, allowing herself to feel the vulnerability that had always been so terrifying. For so long, she had built a life of control and perfection, but now she was realizing that true growth came from embracing the messy, uncertain parts of life. The next few weeks were filled with small steps toward this new version of herself. Linda began to spend more time reflecting. She took up journaling, something she had never considered before. She started volunteering at a local shelter, offering her time and resources in a way she never had. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because she felt something stirring within her, something real, something that went beyond the walls of her penthouse. As Linda adapted to this new way of being, she slowly began to embrace the discomfort, the vulnerability, and the uncertainty. She was learning that life wasn't about perfect control or constant success. It was about connection, about giving, about living with integrity. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, Linda felt a sense of peace she had never known before. The weeks following Linda's decision to step into a new chapter of her life were a whirlwind of activity, filled with both deliberate choices and a sense of urgency. As she ventured further into the territory of vulnerability and connection, she found herself drawn toward the things that promised a sense of genuine fulfillment, things that didn't involve high-powered board meetings, exclusive events, or the art of keeping up appearances. She took up volunteering at a homeless shelter, a cause that had always tugged at her conscience, but had never quite fit into the busy schedule she had meticulously cultivated for herself. She also began spending more time reflecting, journaling, reading, even meditating in the mornings before work. At first, these actions felt like a relief. The very act of stepping away from the ceaseless grind of her old life gave her a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. For the first time in a long while, Linda felt like she was contributing to something meaningful. The people she met at the shelter were humble, grateful, and most strikingly genuine. The rawness of their lives, the unvarnished honesty with which they spoke about their struggles and their hopes, made Linda feel both uncomfortable and oddly liberated. These were not people who cared about the things she had once obsessed over: the right designer clothes, the most prestigious charity galas, the flawless image. They cared about survival, about their next meal, about their families, and about making it through another day. For Linda, these interactions felt like a step closer to something real. She wasn't being admired here for her wealth or status. She was simply being seen as a person. And for the first time in years, that felt good. There was a sense of purpose in her volunteer work that her business ventures could never offer. For the first time, Linda could breathe without the weight of expectation bearing down on her. In the evenings, she returned to the luxurious space she had built for herself, the sprawling apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows, the grand piano in the corner, the artwork that screamed sophistication. Everything in her apartment was designed to be a statement. It was a showcase of her success, her taste, her impeccable ability to curate an enviable life. But lately, Linda had begun to feel like a stranger in her own home. The silence of the apartment, which once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed oppressive. She spent hours wandering through the rooms, wondering what the purpose of it all really was. And then, there were the moments when the external recognition she had always relied upon began to creep back in. She started receiving praise for her charitable work. News outlets picked up on her volunteer efforts and framed her as an example of the new rich who were using their wealth and influence to make a positive difference in the world. It was exactly the kind of attention Linda had once craved. People praised her for her humility and generosity. In this new role, Linda was not just a businesswoman anymore. She was a philanthropist. She had transitioned into a woman of influence, one whose success was now measured not just by her portfolio, but by her good deeds. At first, she basked in the glory of this newfound approval. She spoke at events, attended fundraisers, and was even featured in high-profile publications. Linda was everywhere. The applause, once again, felt intoxicating. She was the star of a new narrative, the woman who had everything and still chose to give back. It was a perfect story. She had gone from being a cold, calculating businesswoman to a compassionate benefactor, someone who had learned the true value of life beyond material success. Her social circles were now filled with other philanthropists and social activists. Her new identity, which she had so carefully crafted, was lauded as authentic. Linda was on top of the world. But beneath the surface, Linda began to sense a growing dissonance. As she continued to bask in the attention of her peers and the public, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this new identity she was constructing was just as hollow as the old one. The validation she was receiving now came from a different source, but it was still validation based on how others perceived her. People were applauding her for giving back, for helping the less fortunate, but what about her? Who is Linda Coleman, really? Despite her newfound sense of purpose, Linda couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something still wasn't right. The more she gave, the more she was recognized. And the more she was recognized, the more she felt empty. The hunger for approval that had always driven her began to feel like a bottomless pit. The desire to be seen for her generosity, for her genuine transformation, took root in her mind, and she found herself constantly seeking affirmation. She attended more events, made more public appearances, and became even more involved in her philanthropic efforts. But with every accolade came a growing sense of unease. She was doing good things, yes, but was she doing them for the right reasons? Were her acts of kindness genuine, or were they simply another way of seeking admiration? One evening, at a high-profile gala for a children's hospital, Linda was seated next to a prominent philanthropist, a woman whose reputation for generosity was legendary. The woman was well into her 70s, but her energy was contagious. As they discussed the latest project Linda had taken on, the conversation turned to the issue of authenticity. "You know, darling," the older woman said, "there's a difference between giving because it feels right and giving because it feels good, because you get the recognition you deserve." Linda paused. The woman's words pierced her thoughts. For a moment, Linda's carefully cultivated mask began to slip. "I think I understand what you mean," Linda said slowly. "But what do you do when you feel as though you're constantly measuring your worth by the approval of others?" The older woman's eyes softened. "I think that's something you'll have to figure out for yourself. But the truth is, as long as you're giving for the sake of your image, you're never really giving at all." Linda felt a wave of discomfort wash over her. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure what she was supposed to say next. The reality of the situation was sinking in. She had built this new life on the same foundation as the one she had left behind. She was still playing a role, still seeking validation, just from a different source. Her philanthropy was no longer about genuine connection with others. It had become another form of the validation she had craved her entire life. And the more she pursued it, the emptier she felt. That night, as she lay in bed, Linda thought about the woman's words. She thought about all the things she had done in the past few months, volunteering, speaking at events, meeting with other philanthropists, and realized that every one of those actions had been driven by the need for recognition. The applause wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Linda had achieved what she thought she wanted. IXTR. NAL validation, a sense of purpose, a meaningful identity. But now that she had it, she realized that it wasn't what she truly needed. The hunger inside her was still there, gnawing at her from within, and no amount of accolades or admiration could fill it. She had become the very thing she had once criticized, someone whose identity was built around external validation. The recognition she sought from others had temporarily filled the void, but now she saw it for what it truly was, a false victory. It was another mask, another performance, and Linda was growing tired of pretending. The truth hit her like a ton of bricks. What she needed wasn't applause or praise. What she needed was to feel truly seen, not for the role she played, but for who she really was. She needed to stop hiding behind the image she had constructed and start confronting the things she had spent years avoiding. In that moment, Linda knew that achieving her goals, her new life of philanthropy, recognition, and public success, hadn't brought her closer to herself. Instead, it had only reinforced the illusion that she had created. She had gotten what she wanted, but it wasn't enough. And for the first time in a long time, Linda felt a shift deep inside her, one that made her realize that the next phase of her journey would have to come from within. This false victory, this outwardly perfect life she had worked so hard to build, had revealed a hard truth. It was only by letting go of the pursuit of validation, by stepping away from the need to be seen as something she was not, that she would finally begin to find the peace. Linda stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse, staring out at the glittering skyline of Manhattan. The city stretched out beneath her, a vast network of lights, energy, and noise. But in that moment, it all felt distant. The usual hustle of the city, once invigorating, now seemed like a background hum to a life that no longer felt hers. The high-end restaurants, the gala invitations, the constant whirlwind of social engagements, everything that had once fueled her sense of accomplishment now felt meaningless. The woman who had spent years curating this perfect life was standing at the precipice of an uncomfortable truth. Her pursuit of external validation, both in her career and her philanthropy, had come at a heavy price. She had gotten what she thought she wanted. But now, standing alone in her luxurious apartment, Linda felt the weight of the emptiness that lay beneath the surface. Her attempts to fill the void with accolades, recognition, and social approval had only deepened her disconnection from herself. The once thrilling applause now sounded like an echo in a cavern, a reminder of how hollow it had all become. The worst part was that Linda wasn't sure how she had arrived at this place. She had always been so driven, so focused on succeeding and proving herself. But in chasing approval from others, she had lost sight of what she truly valued. The applause had become her drug, her constant need for external affirmation, but it had never been enough. Each new achievement, each new layer of public recognition, was just another high, followed by an even deeper low. She was trapped in a cycle of needing validation and never feeling truly seen. Linda had always prided herself on being self-sufficient. She had built her empire from the ground up, and no one had given her anything. She had always believed that if she worked hard enough, if she achieved enough, she could create a life that would make her proud. But as she looked back on everything she had accomplished, she realized that what she had built had been for the wrong reasons. It wasn't about meaning or purpose. It had been about impressing others, about being admired. It had been about proving to the world, and to herself, that she was worthy. Her volunteer work had initially given her a sense of fulfillment, but it quickly became another form of performance. She wasn't doing it solely for the sake of others. She was doing it to bolster her image. The praise she received for her charitable efforts fed into the same need for approval that had driven her throughout her life. The public recognition for her humble contributions, the articles written about her genuine transformation, only deepened her sense of disillusionment. She had thought that giving back would be the answer to her discontent, but it had become just another way for her to feed the hunger for admiration. Linda felt the consequences of this realization settling in slowly. At first, the dissonance had been subtle. It was the unease in her stomach when she received an award, or the emptiness she felt after attending a fundraiser where everyone congratulated her, but no one truly knew her. But now, that feeling was growing more pronounced, more undeniable. The life she had built was no longer enough to satisfy her. She had worked tirelessly to create an identity based on success, recognition, and admiration, but she now understood that this identity was nothing but a carefully constructed facade. And the worst part was that she had played a part in creating it. Her personal relationships, too, had begun to suffer. Linda had always been close with a select group of people, colleagues, fellow philanthropists, friends who were part of her social circle. But she couldn't help but feel that these relationships had always been transactional. She was surrounded by people who admired her success, who celebrated her achievements, but how many of them actually knew her? How many of them saw past the persona she had cultivated? She had become so focused on maintaining her image that she had neglected the deeper connections that truly mattered. Linda had a heart-to-heart conversation with her longtime friend, Veronica, a fellow businesswoman who had known her since their college days. Veronica had been there through the early years of Linda's career, supporting her when things were difficult and celebrating with her during moments of triumph. But even Veronica had begun to notice the changes in Linda. Over coffee one afternoon, Veronica said, "I can't help but feel like I don't know who you are anymore, Linda. You've changed." Linda had bristled at the comment. How could Veronica say that? She had worked so hard to build the life she had, and now this? But as the conversation continued, Linda realized that Veronica wasn't criticizing her. She was simply acknowledging a truth that Linda had been avoiding. The success Linda had worked so hard to attain had come at the expense of something far more valuable, her authenticity. Veronica continued, "I've watched you become someone who is more about the spotlight than the substance. You're always running around trying to impress everyone, but I don't know who the real Linda is anymore. And I don't think you do either." The sting of Veronica's words hit Linda harder than she expected. She had always prided herself on being self-aware, on being in control of her destiny, but now she realized that she had lost touch with the very core of who she was. She had been so busy chasing external markers of success that she had neglected the inner compass that once guided her. She had become disconnected from her own heart, and that disconnect had left her feeling isolated, even among the people she called her friends. The internal conflict began to gnaw at Linda more and more. She was no longer satisfied with the life she had built, but she didn't know how to break free from the expectations she had set for herself. Her life had become a performance, and she didn't know how to stop acting. How could she step off the stage when she had spent so long trying to perfect her role? She had thought that validation from others would fill the emptiness inside her, but now she realized that it had only made her more acutely aware of how disconnected she felt from herself. In the days that followed, Linda tried to distract herself from the weight of these realizations. She threw herself into more charitable events, attended more galas, and signed more philanthropic projects. She kept busy, as she always had, trying to outrun the uncomfortable truth that had begun to settle in her chest. But no matter how many charity auctions she attended or how many people congratulated her on her transformation, the emptiness remained. The applause no longer carried the same satisfaction it once had. Every victory, every moment of recognition, felt like a fleeting high that left her craving more. One evening, as Linda walked through the halls of a prestigious fundraiser for a children's hospital, she caught sight of a familiar face. It was James Hart, the elderly veteran whose quiet dignity had haunted her since their first meeting at the Blue Star Café. He was sitting alone at a table near the back, observing the crowd with the same calm demeanor that Linda had remembered. For a brief moment, she considered walking over to him to see if he could offer some of the wisdom she had come to value. But she hesitated. The space between them felt insurmountable. What could she possibly say to him? Would he see through her facade? James Hart's presence, as serene as it was, only magnified Linda's internal turmoil. She was surrounded by people who admired her, but she had never felt more alone. The applause, the attention, the accolades, they were no longer enough. What she had thought would fill her soul had only left her more empty. Her pursuit of validation, her need to be seen as something more, had cost her the very thing she had been seeking: true connection. Linda had paid the price for her choices, and the cost was steep. She had sacrificed authenticity for approval, and in doing so, had lost touch with the one person who truly mattered: herself. The irony of it all hit her like a gut punch. She had spent years building a life that was meant to bring her fulfillment, but in the end, all she had built was a house of cards, shaky, fragile, and destined to collapse. As the night wore on, Linda knew she could no longer pretend that the life she had created was enough. The realization was painful, but it was also liberating. She had paid the price for her pursuit of approval, and now it was time to face the consequences. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew that the first step was to stop living for others and start living for herself. It was time to rebuild, this time from the inside out. The price had been heavy, but Linda was finally ready to face the truth that had been staring her in the face all along. The life she had built was nothing without authenticity. The cityscape of Manhattan glittered outside the windows of Linda's penthouse, just as it always had. The bustling streets, the endless parade of taxis, the towering glass buildings that seemed to touch the sky, it all remained unchanged. And yet, for Linda, everything felt different now. She had spent so many years viewing her world through a lens of ambition and external validation that it was almost surreal to see it all in this new light. She had returned to her familiar situation, but with a new truth, a new understanding that had irrevocably shifted her perception of everything around her. It had been weeks since her conversation with Veronica, and Linda had spent that time in deep reflection, reassessing her life, her choices, and the identity she had been so desperate to cultivate. She had let go of the need to prove herself, to live up to the expectations of others, and had instead begun the process of reconnecting with the parts of herself she had long ignored. No longer was she chasing the fleeting highs of public recognition, nor was she relying on her philanthropic endeavors as a means of building a new, polished image. Linda had learned that the only validation worth seeking was the one that came from within. But living authentically in a world that still valued appearances wasn't easy. The pressure to maintain the carefully curated life she had once so diligently built still loomed large. It was hard to shake the habit of seeking external approval when it had been the foundation of her identity for so long. Linda knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges, and there would be moments when the temptation to revert to her old ways would feel almost irresistible. But she also knew that the path she had started down was the only one that could lead to true fulfillment. The first step in her journey toward authenticity was to change the way she approached her social life. Linda had always been at the center of things, invited to the most exclusive events, rubbing shoulders with the elite, the powerful, and the influential. She had enjoyed the sense of prestige that came with those invitations, but she now realized that most of her relationships had been shallow, built on mutual self-interest rather than genuine connection. The people she had surrounded herself with were mostly concerned with their own status and image, just as she had been. But Linda knew that if she was going to change, she needed to rebuild her social circle from the ground up. One afternoon, she called a few people who had truly mattered to her over the years, those who had been there for her before the money, the fame, the accolades. These were friends she had lost touch with over the years, people she had neglected in favor of cultivating her high society persona. One of them was Megan, an old college friend who had always been straightforward with Linda, even when it wasn't what Linda wanted to hear. They had drifted apart after Linda's career took off, but Linda knew that Megan, with her no-nonsense approach, was the kind of person who could help ground her. Megan was surprised to hear from Linda, but she agreed to meet. They sat in a small, unpretentious cafe on the Upper East Side, a far cry from the extravagant venues Linda was used to frequenting. Megan hadn't changed much over the years. She still wore simple, comfortable clothes, and her face was free of makeup. But it was Megan's authenticity that struck Linda the most. She didn't feel the need to impress anyone, and that simplicity was something Linda had come to admire. The conversation that day was unlike any Linda had had in years. There was no pretense, no careful curation of words. They spoke openly and honestly about their lives, their struggles, and the choices they had made. Megan listened intently as Linda explained the journey she had been on, the recognition, the disillusionment, and the realization that she had been living her life for others, not for herself. "You know, Linda," Megan said after a long pause, "it takes a lot of courage to admit all that, to recognize that you've been chasing something that was never really yours to begin with. I think you've done a lot of work to get here, and it's not easy to be honest with yourself about your own motivations." Linda felt a deep sense of gratitude toward Megan in that moment. She had never truly appreciated the value of someone who was willing to be real with her. It wasn't about the approval or the compliments. It was about understanding and being understood. In that small, unremarkable cafe, Linda felt a sense of connection that had been missing from her life for years. As Linda continued to spend time with people like Megan, she began to realize just how much of her old life had been built on a foundation of fragility. Her connections had been superficial, her sense of self defined by the roles she played. But now, as she allowed herself to be more vulnerable, she found that she could still be successful and respected, without needing to be the center of attention. She didn't have to be the philanthropist or the businesswoman to feel valuable. She could simply be Linda. But this new way of living wasn't without its struggles. Linda had built an entire career around presenting a specific image to the world, and many of the people in her orbit had known her as that version of herself. The expectations of her old life still loomed large, and she often found herself wondering if the people around her would still respect her if she let go of the facade. Would they still value her if she stopped trying to live up to their expectations? The first test came when Linda was invited to a major gala for a charity she had supported for years. The event was a celebration of her contributions, and she had been asked to give a speech. In the past, Linda would have relished the spotlight. She would have rehearsed her words, carefully crafted her image, and smiled graciously for the cameras. But this time, things were different. Linda knew that if she were to speak, it had to come from a place of genuine conviction, not from the polished, practiced version of herself that everyone expected. The night of the gala arrived, and Linda stood backstage, listening to the applause of the crowd as the other speakers were introduced. She could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline, the anticipation of being the center of attention. It was tempting to slip into her old role, to smile, to deliver the speech that had been carefully scripted for her. But as she looked out at the audience, she remembered the conversations she had had with people like Megan. She remembered the feeling of being truly seen and heard. It wasn't about what people thought of her. It was about the message she wanted to convey. When Linda stepped onto the stage, she took a deep breath. The spotlight was still blinding, the crowd still expectant, but this time, she wasn't playing a role. She spoke from the heart, talking about her own journey, the mistakes she had made, and the lessons she had learned. She spoke about the importance of authenticity, of being true to oneself, and of finding fulfillment not in external validation, but in inner peace. The response was not what Linda had expected. There were no grand applause or standing ovations, no flashing cameras. Instead, There was a quiet respect in the room, a recognition that Linda was finally being real. She had let go of the need to be perfect, to live up to the expectations of others, and in doing so, she had found something far more valuable, her true self. As the night drew to a close, Linda felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. The applause that followed her speech wasn't the loud, frantic kind that used to make her feel validated. It was softer, more genuine. And for the first time, Linda realized that this kind of approval was all she truly needed. Not the admiration of the world, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had been authentic. In the months that followed, Linda continued to make changes in her life. She began to let go of relationships that no longer served her, and she focused on cultivating deeper, more meaningful connections. She embraced her vulnerability, knowing that it was through her imperfections that she had found her strength. The external accolades were no longer her driving force. Instead, Linda was driven by a quiet sense of purpose, a purpose that came from within. Her work in philanthropy continued, but now it was no longer about her image or the recognition that came with it. It was about making a real difference, not because it would make her look good, but because it was the right thing to do. She had learned that true success wasn't measured by how others saw her, but by how she saw herself. She was no longer playing a role, she was living her truth. Linda had returned to her familiar world, but she was no longer the same person who had first stepped into it. She had confronted the emptiness that had driven her for so long, and in doing so, she had found a new way of being, one that was authentic, grounded, and meaningful. The applause had faded, but in its place, Linda found a deeper sense of fulfillment. The journey was far from over, but Linda knew that the road ahead would be one where she could walk with her head held high, no longer seeking approval from others, but finding peace in her own heart.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.